And now I would like to introduce Dr. Richard Ehrhardt. And he is the one, our premier speaker. So he will be our first class, and even the next Monday, he will be also speaking. And so do you want to introduce, and whenever it's your time, Dr. Ehrhardt, and we are so grateful to you to be with us.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I appreciate this opportunity. And just a little bit about my background for your audience. I'm the sheep and goat specialist at Michigan State. I've been here for, since 2009. And I worked as a research scientist working with sheep and cattle before that. I've also have my own flock of sheep, which I've maintained. I have about 200 ewes on an accelerated lambing program. So I'll bring some of those experiences to bear on this talk as well. And so today's topic, hopefully we're gonna like each other because I'm gonna be with you for 2 weeks. So this first week, I'm gonna talk about some key considerations in building a commercial flock. And so this will be part one, talking about the type, thinking about your farm resources and choosing an appropriate production system, and then also perhaps matching that production system to opportunities you have in terms of marketing. So as a broad overview here, get my slides to advance.
Do you want to share again, please, your screen? Because
Oh, sure. Yes. I didn't realize it wasn't sharing, so I'll reshare it.
please, keep it off. Yeah.
Yep. How's that?
Yeah, good. You want
Okay, great.
to go to the first one?
Yeah. So as the topic today, I'm going to talk about matching your production system to your farm resources and your target markets. And I'm going to talk about understanding the different diverse land markets we have in the United States and talking about choosing the right type of sheep. When you talk about selecting animals, I think we have to be cognizant of, the markets that we're shooting for and understand these markets because there's different opportunities that we have. And that picture's changed quite a bit over the last 15, 20 years. So if you think about your resources and I guess your limitations as well, as far as land, first question becomes, do you have access to affordable grazing land or perhaps crop residue or cover crops, permanent pasture opportunities, or just land that's really not well developed but might be suitable for sheep or goats? And then from the human dimension, do you have experience with livestock in general? I find that people who have experience with livestock, for example, when I work with a dairy farmer who's interested in raising sheep, I kind of know where they're coming from. I know what skill set they bring to the table in terms of nutrition and management. And so having some livestock experience can be of benefit. Sheep specific experience or goat specific experience also. And then perhaps access to good mentors. And as far as another important skill to consider is if for direct marketing, do you have experience or really the motivation or interest in doing that? That's a specialized set of skills that you need to take into account because the transaction cost of doing direct marketing is pretty high, and it tends to fit really well for people who are experienced like that sort of thing. Some people really don't. And so that's an important consideration. Markets. Do you have good local markets? Do you have the potential for selling lambs or kids right from your farm? Or do you have access to good public markets? In my part of the world, that both of those are possible. However, there's more remote regions of the area that I program in the northern part of the state that just don't have much opportunity for farm gate sales or public auctions, so they have to truck their animals a considerable distance to market. That all impacts the type of production system and whole operation that you might choose. Okay. Other considerations would be your overhead or your facilities, the type of infrastructure, you could call it infrastructure, if you will. Do you have farm buildings that exist? If you happen to buy a farm that has some large buildings, like I purchased a farm in New York about 25 years ago that had a large dairy barn that was no longer modern or really suitable for dairy production was excellent for sheep. So that was an asset in my particular case. Do you have the skills or experience or um, I guess desire to build a lot of equipment or to renovate an old barn? That's another consideration. And then when we look at the feeding part of a program, do you have access to partnerships to own equipment? It would be pretty challenging in a small to medium sized farm to buy all the equipment you might think you need for sheep farming, in terms, especially for forage harvesting. So either you need to buy your forage or you need to consider some kind of cooperative agreement with other people. Do you have access to custom harvesters? I know some large farms who don't own any, who have 4 or 5,000 ewes, who don't own any like forage harvest equipment. Everything's done custom because they live in a part of the country where they can have custom harvesters do it so much more efficiently than they can. Do you have cooperative buying power? For example, if you're trying to secure um, hay, uh, for for example, do you have the opportunity to work with some other people with similar goals as you, that so you can get some economy of scale in buying like large lots of hay? Sometimes that can make a really big difference, and you can work with other producers to do so. And then finally, as far as like feed, grain, and so forth, if you can make your own custom mixes of grain, it's far cheaper than often buying packaged feeds. So that requires, however, access to feed mills that are able to make custom orders for you. So all of these things help dictate the type of system that you might choose to run on your particular operation. Some of the production, these are just a broad overview of production systems you would find in the Midwest USA in fairly broad categories. I have them grouped largely according to the birth management program, whether they're indoor or outdoor birth, or actually there's a kind of a hybrid system called drop lot system I'll quickly describe. I'm not going to go over these systems in great detail, but I'll try to be a bit descriptive. So we have annual lambing in midwinter. This is kind of an old system where you basically have your sheep or goats give birth in the middle of the pasture dormancy period. So you're feeding a lot of stored feed and so forth. A lot of purebred operations would fit this mode because they control a lot of the environment of the animals in the feeding program. Then we have annual birth programs that are pasture birth. Not as many people do this, but this would be the dominant system you'd find like in New Zealand or Australia. You'd rarely have an indoor birth system. Doing a pasture birth program is far less, it seems intense in terms of labor, but a single person can lamb a lot more ewes outdoors than indoors. Granted, there are greater risks for hypothermia, things like that, but you can manage those things with careful planning. But that would be a system to consider if you don't have any barn space. We have some flocks in Michigan that have several thousand ewes that don't own a barn at all. They lamb everything outside, just like they do overseas, and they even feed their sheep outside in the winter. So they have zero facilities, and that's a really good system for them. Then we have annual lambing in the spring, where they have a drop lot system. What that means is simply the animals give birth in a lot near like a small holding area near a barn. They're brought indoors to put in small bonding pens for a few days, and then they're put back on pasture. So it's kind of a hybrid between pasture lambing, because you put the sheep on pasture pretty quickly. They spend very little time indoors, and indoor lambing. Actually, a drop lot system is what's used in the American West for predominantly what they use in almost all the range flocks. They bring those ewes in the winter, lamb them very quickly through a building, and then put them back on pasture very quickly. Then we have annual lambing, where you might have multiple birth periods during the year. We have flocks that do that. They'll have a spring and a fall lambing. They'll still be 12 months. So I say annual, meaning 12 months. But they will have multiple birth periods, and that can help spread out their labor a little bit, have them allow them to access markets that they wouldn't normally be able to access because they have more of a year-round supply of lamb. And then the system I'm fairly familiar with is called accelerated lambing. This is certainly a more intensified system. You actually shorten the birth period from 12 months, an annual program, to 8 months. This allows for a year-round production, and you can increase the productivity of a ewe considerably doing the system, but it does require a winter lambing period, which in most climates means indoors. So you need greater facilities, greater feeding management for a system such as this. The labor might be perceived as being higher. It is higher in the sense that you have a consistently higher labor, but if you think of labor in terms of labor per unit product or labor per lamb, it's actually sometimes lower than an annual birth system. So that's kind of interesting situation. All right, so let's talk about some scenarios. Let's say you just happen to be of someone with farm experience. Maybe you raise dairy cows. This is a common scenario for me. And they want to convert these facilities to sheep. The assets that they would have is they'd know how to produce quality forage. They'd have facilities that could easily be adapted for sheep. So they have some assets that allow them to choose a different production system. And let's say they're in a part of the country that has access to year-round markets for a lot of lamb sizes. I think an accelerated system with really prolific sheep could be a good fit for someone like this because they have the management know-how to manage animals that way, and they have access to good stored feed and facilities. The challenges they're going to have, and I know this firsthand, is their sheep aren't cows, so they're going to have to learn a little bit about sheep. But usually that surprisingly can be overcome fairly easily, I've found. They're always going to be challenged with the issues of trying to get good aseasonal reproduction or out of season conception. We can solve those with good management practices as well. And then often they'll have some problems with house sheep with respiratory issues. So those are some things that they'll have to focus on. Let's think of another scenario. And let's say we have a new producer, and this is a common scenario, who's maybe inherited or just wanted to buy a large piece of perhaps lower value land that's suitable for agriculture or zoned agriculture, but doesn't have any facilities. So their assets are this land that could be improved by grazing. Let's say they have access to the non-traditional lamb market, which is pretty much most people do in the Midwest and Eastern United States. And I'll describe these markets in a few minutes. Let's say a good system for this might be using, for example, hair sheep that in a pasture lambing system, lambing once per year. There's less labor involved in shearing these sheep, certainly. They tend to be more parasite resistant, although that's not an absolute. And they don't have facilities, so annual birth on a pasture would be a good fit. But they're going to have some challenges too, of course. This isn't like this, it's going to be a simple system necessarily. That just because it's lower input system doesn't mean it doesn't require skill and management. They're going to have to develop a grazing plan. They're going to have to consider some efficient animal handling so they can round the animals up and treat them and market them. And then also they're going to have to consider a predator control plan in this mix, and that's an important consideration. And then finally, of course, one of the big challenges we have in all pasture-based production, especially with lambs and kids grazing, is parasite management. So that's going to require special effort, and I'm sure you're going to learn about that more specifically in this course.
Richard, you tell me, when do you want the poll? The first one.
Now is perfect, actually. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I will just launch the poll. The idea is that you will be answering now. You have a question. What production system described has the lowest lambing and feeding labor needs? So, and I seen that 3 of 41 people, 5, 6, 10, around 40% have answered, 41. 48, they have 60. Oh, you are so fast, guys. Oh, yeah. Okay, good.
They're not sleeping.
No, they're not sleeping. And some of them, they are thinking very well. We need only 3 more people. Probably we are the ones. Okay.
That's probably true. So it looks like the definitely the dominant answer here is pasture lambing. I'd agree that it's the lowest lambing and feeding labor. I'd say drop lot lambing would be still pretty high labor in my opinion, because you and certainly lambing labor because you have to move all of the sheep into small management pens. I've found that um, I've single people or a single manager in some of the farms I work with can manage 800,000 ewes in a pasture lambing environment, whereas indoor lambing, your drop lot system, it'd probably be half that number or even less. So I'd say it's a lower system. So very good. All right. Oh, share the results if you want to see how well you did. You did a good job with that one. So we talked about some scenarios here. Let's just summarize this. So these intensive systems are going to require more inputs and buildings and machinery, things like that, infrastructure, but they're going to have greater outputs, and they're going to tend to have a steady and more consistent demand for labor. They're best suited for land, if I would make a big generalization here, of greater productivity. Whereas pasture-based systems are lower labor in the sense of feeding and birth management. They're certainly lower in infrastructure cost and feed costs because there's less stored feed, but they do require thoughtful management to overcome the challenges of parasites and also the nutritional limits of pasture. Although pasture can meet the nutrient requirements of many classes of sheep, if you have prolific sheep that are giving birth to twins or even triplets, they're going to be a little challenged in a pasture-based system. That doesn't mean you shouldn't pursue one, but you might need to consider the changing your genetics, which we'll talk about next week, to match a system so it's most appropriate for a pasture-based system, or find a way to supplement the animals, which is another consideration. I'm going to move to the next sort of component of my talk and talk about lamb markets. And you may or may not be familiar with these. I'll assume you're not, so forgive me if you're very familiar. I would broadly put them in 2 categories, although that's probably not, quite accurate. We have what we call the traditional market, which is a market for large lambs that tend to be fat, relatively fat. They're the lamb that you'll see in the grocery store, for example, would be this. Most of it, the majority of it, is supplied by imported product, which may surprise some people. It still is a growing segment. Demand for this product has picked up over the years. So this is kind of historically what I would say, that's why it's called the traditional market, what the sheep industry has been about. However, we also have a very significant market, particularly in the eastern United States and on the coasts, of what we call the non-traditional, and some people will call it ethnic market. I'm going to stick with the term non-traditional, although I'm not sure that's my favorite term either. These tend to be lighter lambs, for sure. Certainly less than 120 pounds, more like less than 100 pounds. I'm finding that in this market, demand for these lambs has the size has increased over the years. Grading is less systematic in the sense that most of these lambs aren't formally graded. They're inspected, but they're not given a USDA yield grade of 1 to 5. Not necessarily, anyhow. A lot of the places where they're killed don't need to do that. There's no great demand for it. They're often sold as whole carcasses, even at the retail level. It's a growing market in the United States, and it's mostly supplied by domestic product. So, and the carcass size is going to be smaller, and there's definitely demand because there's a greater demand for fresh product. These lambs are leaner. They don't do as well being shipped from overseas, and they tend to prefer domestic product. Okay, so talking about the traditional market, I think I'll skip this slide because I realize it's kind of went over this pretty well. Actually, I'll say a few words about it. So if we focus on the traditional market, it may or may not be a good choice for our markets in the Midwest. And that's going to depend a lot on our cost of feed and really our productivity. Um, some people do like the traditional market. I market to both myself, my own farm, um, because I do a certain number of lambs that I sell through a freezer program. The advantage of these larger lambs is if you have them custom slaughtered, the processing cost is the same, whether it's a big lamb or a small lamb in many instances. Therefore, it's pretty efficient. You get more value out of that carcass with these larger lambs. I'll talk about the market specifications in a little bit. You can't just decide to suddenly hit both markets unless you have the right type of genetics to do so. Okay, so the non-traditional market, some general aspects of it are, again, it's not graded, they're smaller and leaner. They're often bought at the farm gate. Not always. Most of the lamb in Michigan that enters this market is going to go through traditional channels and not be bought at the farm gate. We have several slaughter facilities that specialize in this market. It's going to often have a religious slaughter protocol. Much of this lamb that enters this market is for the people of the Muslim faith, and it's killed halal. You could also include kosher lamb, which is a very different product, a large lamb, and not nearly as large of a market, but it is part of the, it does have a very strict religious slaughter protocol. This is a very diverse market, many different types of product, leanness, age. There's many subcomponents of this. I'll describe two in just a few minutes. So this is a big market. In most of the Midwest, it's larger than the traditional market. Many people who've been in the sheep industry for a long time aren't aware of this. But if you're starting out in the industry, it's good to appreciate this no matter what, but it might not be quite as surprising to you at least. In my part of the world, it's the vast majority of lambs born enter this market. I'm not sure what it would be for Missouri, but I'm guessing it would be substantial as well. And it's a stable market. It tends to have far less fluctuation in price, probably because it's less impacted by imported product and less impacted by the supply and demand dynamics of the Western USA. Most of our traditional market in the US, those big lambs, aren't necessarily coming from the Midwest. The vast majority, 90% plus, come from the American West, from big sheep raised on range and put through feedlots. So those are lambs that come in off of the range in the fall. They're fed in feedlots. So there's a large, a very large supply deficit or excess and then deficit during certain parts of the year. There's probably greater competition for buyers. There's many more buyers in our non-traditional lamb market. And this demand's consistent year round. So that's a good thing about it. And again, it's less likely to be substituted by foreign product. And these consumers are pretty fixated on lamb. They prefer lamb over beef, and they're not as probably quite as price sensitive to it. And this is an increasing demographic, relatively speaking, in the United States. The people who constitute this particular market, it's a growing group of people. If we were to look at some projected population increases in the United States, we'd see that the Muslim growth compared to other rest of the population in North America is projected to be quite faster growth. So that means this market, it's big now, but it's only going to get bigger, which is a good thing for the sheep and goat industry. I happen to interact a fair bit with the non-traditional market. I take students to downtown Detroit, which happens to have the largest Muslim population in the United States. I know a couple of the purveyors, people who sell retail lamb, and this happens to be a fellow by the name of Ron Berry. And we visit him, and it's more like an old-fashioned butcher shop you would have seen in Midwest United States 20, 30 years ago when I was a kid, where you get custom cut meat right in front of you. You might see that in a few large grocery stores now, but he does this here. He's making a special pocket in a roast for a customer. And so everything's custom cut right in front of the customer. The consumers are right there, right in front of him, and he gets really good direct feedback on what they want and what they need. So the non-traditional market is very diverse, and each of it has, kind of unique dynamics. They vary greatly in specification, and I'll talk about those a little bit here. So it's relatively consistent, and there's also some little peaks. Like there's a few religious holidays in the Muslim faith at the end of Ramadan, and also the Festival of Sacrifice that will create some peaks in demand that are good to be aware of. But if over the years, I found that the consistency of demand is pretty high in this market. And a lot of these different ethnic enclaves that constitute we'll call the ethnic or non-traditional market, the demand for some of their product kind of overlap and fill in different gaps. So there's different components that allow for it to be a more consistent market. I'll just describe two, there's many more, distinct non-traditional markets. One of them, and I've had familiarity with these, we have them in Michigan. I used to live in New York State, and we had them more even evident there. We had milk-fed or hothouse lambs. These are mostly for Greek Orthodox, Italian consumers, which are two pretty different cultures, but that just happens to be who's interested in these milk-fed lambs. These are small carcasses, actually small lambs, 35 to 70-pound lambs. So these are right off the mom usually. And there is seasonal demand. We see peaks right at Christmas and Easter, and it's a pretty short-lived market, but there's premiums paid basically to produce the fattest lamb you can at that size. And that's a challenge because these lambs are relatively immature. They're not really in the physiological state where you'd expect fattening to occur. So they have to be fed. The mothers have to be milking hard. The lambs typically are on creep feed and fed some grain to really get a premium. This is a pretty specialized market. It can be profitable, and it can be, it isn't always as profitable as people perceive. So it kind of is a little bit of a less of a less consistency in that regard. It does require indoor birth and supplemental feeding, as I described. Then we have a more broad-based market that's larger. I'll call it the halal or Muslim market in our particular part of the world. It's pretty big. These are mostly sort of lambs that are 80 to 100 pounds, maybe a little bit broader than that. These are going to be lambs that are relatively lean, not skinny, but lean. They're a little bit smaller, they're a little bit younger, less mature often, not always, but they tend to be lean. They don't want extra fat on these lambs. They want them adequately finished. This is a big market in many parts of the US. There's consistent demand, as I said, with some peaks. The quality specifications for this market can be met right off pasture. And so that can be an advantage of this market because you don't necessarily have to do grain feeding. Although many will choose to do a short grain feeding program because of its efficiency and cheap gains that you can get, it isn't necessary to hit this market. Here's just a picture of some lambs that are milk-fed lambs that are ready to market any day. So they'll be sold right off these moms. And these lambs look like they're about 50 or 60 pounds on average. They could fit either this Italian market or this Greek market. The larger lambs tend to fit the Greek Orthodox market of 60, 70-pound lambs. The smaller 40-pound lambs tend to go to this Italian market. These are sold as whole carcasses and cooked that way. Here's just a picture of lambs I sold many years ago now that kind of epitomize like the type of lambs that you'd see in a market like this. So as far as the non-traditional market goes, you can fit these, this market, the specifications can be met with pasture-based systems. Some might choose to use some supplemental pastures. I'm showing a picture from my farm where I've grown some specialty crops to fill in gaps in forage production. These happen to be grazing radishes. That's a pretty efficient system in a pasture-based system to provide a little extra calories and maybe some lower parasite infectivity ground to finish lambs on grass. So that's just an example of one way you can manage that. Um, so the traditional lamb market, again, these are large lambs. I described the non-traditional one, and these are going to be fat lambs. These are a lot bigger. These are twice as big. And interestingly, and I don't always understand this, the demand for the size of these carcasses has just gotten bigger and bigger. It's the most of the lambs that you see killed in the United States actually in Colorado and in California, which are the largest processing plants, are going to be 70-pound carcasses. These are 140, 150-pound lambs, and these are pretty fat lambs, surprisingly fat. So basically, the way this works is they'll use a pasture-based system to create feeder lambs that'll go into feedlots. So it's possible in Missouri to sell lambs to feedlots that would feed them further. But I would question the profitability of that and look at the non-traditional market, because essentially what we used to sell as feeder lambs fit pretty well into the non-traditional market as lambs to be killed. So that's kind of an interesting consideration. It's definitely more efficient to create these lambs using a terminal sire system. And there's huge swings in the value of these lambs. I believe right now these lambs are pretty profitable, but year in and year out, that equation changes pretty quickly. It's a much more volatile market. I would say it's a profitable market if you've got a specialized market where you're selling freezer lambs. It also could be a profitable market for some of the farmers I work with who grow their own grain. These are large farms. They grow grain as a commodity to sell, and instead of selling it to the open market, they'll just sell it through their lambs. So that kind of works for them. But I would say, unless you own your own grain source, or you're not selling specialty lambs to a small client base, this might not be a great fit.
Richard, what about, do you want the next?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Thank you for reminding me.
Sure. Okay, now you have, which of these are no major difference between the traditional and not traditional land market in the Midwest? Select one of them.
Yeah, which of these are not major differences?
Yeah. We have half of the people that answered already. 70%, almost done.
I didn't mean for this to be a trick question. It's like, basically, which one of these things is not true? Okay.
Yeah. Okay, I am ending. Okay, over there, the results. Are you seeing the results?
Yeah, it looks like they're being shared actively. Yes, so didn't mean to be tricky here. So let me just go over these quick. The traditional market demands lambs of yield grade 2, which is true. The non-traditional lamb market demands lambs smaller cuts. That's also true. The non-traditional lamb sells a lot of lamb as primal cuts and whole carcasses. True. So those are all correct answers. The one that you should choose here is D, which means that which says that imported lambs makes up a greater proportion of lamb consumed by the non-traditional market compared to the traditional market. That's not true. There's not as much imported lamb in this market. So that's important to understand. So that would be the choice. That one is not a major difference. Okay. All right, so let's talk about sheep size, because that's an important and highly relevant to considering your market. So, the size of sheep you have, you should consider that in terms of what your target market is. Another consideration in that is, can you use terminal sires to achieve your marketing goal? So a terminal sire is simply a sire that you use to correct deficits in your ewe base. I'll describe that in a second. So choosing the right size sheep to your market, one main factor to consider is what percent of maturity you're selling at. So well-fed lambs reach the ideal carcass yield, or their degree of fatness, between 60 and 75% of their mature size. That's the size of their mom. So you have to kind of look at a ram, know what his mom's weight would be, which is approximately 2/3 of a ram's weight, and market those lambs between these numbers. You can sell them relatively less mature at 60% for this non-traditional market, because there's a demand for those and they want leaner lambs. As the lambs become more mature at 75%, they're going to be fatter. That works pretty well for the traditional market. Okay, so there's a little bit of a sliding scale there. So the lower range is, as I said, for the non-traditional market, and the higher range would be for the traditional market. So terminal sires, as I introduced, are sires to produce offspring that go to market. Okay, you aren't meant to be keeping these offspring, if they're ewe lambs, to become replacement ewes in your flock, because they'll generally be big and growthy and not necessarily have the maternal traits you're seeking in your flock. They might be too big and less productive, but they sure look nice because they're big and growthy. The offspring are not to be retained as breeding stock, and the idea is to correct some deficits in your maternal line of sheep. And that's pretty common, that our maternal line of sheep may be slightly less muscular, and maybe a little bit smaller, which are good things in terms of efficiency, but not quite as ideal for market quality. So kind of the idea is, using these terminal sires, is you can have smaller ewes that are more productive and get some growth and better carcass traits in the lambs that you sell. So you get some growth, carcass weight, and you'll also gain some feed efficiency. That means it'll take less pounds of feed to produce a pound of lamb when these lambs are larger and a little relatively less mature at a particular body weight. They have a little different body composition. They're leaner. Leaner lambs grow more efficiently. There's far less feed involved in producing a pound of lean than fat. So that's another improvement you get. And carcass quality. You can improve some carcass quality to a degree with terminal sires. At least that's a goal. Sometimes that's not always achieved. You also get this wonderful thing called hybrid vigor, or heterosis is a fancy term for it, where it's almost magic. Basically, you get better growth of your lambs than like if you took the average growth rate of the sire and average growth rate of a dam, and they're very different breeds, the offspring are going to have not the average between those, but a higher level. And that extra level of growth is called hybrid vigor. And it's a wonderful thing to have. Also, you get some improvements in survival of lambs. So those are some nice advantages. Just an example here of a terminal sire system is to use, for example, a large framed ram like the Suffolk on these smaller ewes that are have a lot of lambs. So you have these prolific moms producing lots of lambs. The crossbred lambs, the speckle-faced lambs, are going to grow much more quickly than this maternal line, and they're going to have perhaps greater carcass merit as well. So some examples of good and bad systems. Let's work through an example here. Let's say you have average size or moderate size ewes, maybe a Finn Dorset cross, on 50 acres, and you breed them to Suffolk rams. Okay, so on a piece of land like that, let's just assume that you can stock about 166 ewes, or around 3.5 ewes per acre, something like that. Let's assume that these ewes have they're pretty nice prolific ewes. They've got a fair bit of fin breeding. They're going to have what, 1.9 lambs. Let's say you're selling 80-pound lambs. You get about 500 pounds of lambs per acre if you did this math. Okay, sounds pretty good. Let's consider another scenario where instead of having these relatively moderate sized ewes, you decide, I want big sheep. I want to have crossbred ewes that are maybe a Dorset Rambouillet Suffolk cross. Nice looking sheep, bigger, little growthier, larger framed, kind of a common scenario. They weigh 190 pounds. 50 acres isn't going to support as many ewes. And let's say you're selling 80-pound lambs, and let's say you breed those to moderate sized Suffolk rams. So you can only support 144 ewes. They're not as productive. They don't have as much fin breeding, and they're still, you're selling 80-pound lambs. You're going to have 370 pounds per acre produced in that scenario. And if you're selling to the non-traditional market, 80-pound lambs, you're going to get far more pounds per acre out of this system than this system. Let's just say, though, you get the magic large breed of sheep, Dorset Rambouillet Suffolk ewes, that happen to have greater productivity and maybe are the same as your ewes, which probably isn't a realistic scenario. Even with that, just because of their size, you're going to have less ewes per acre. You're still going to have far less productivity in a system like that than if you had these smaller ewes bred to larger rams. Okay, hopefully that's clear. So the take home is that moderate sized ewes matched with larger rams are going to produce more pounds of lamb per acre than large ewes bred to moderate sized rams. Hopefully this makes sense. You basically have a lot less mass of ewe overhead. If you think of your flock as one giant ewe, it's going to be much less overhead and much more lambs from that system. Okay. So let's look at a few examples of the Mr. Maternal size rules. Let's say you've got polypay sheep, maybe not as good of a scenario for Missouri, but I'm sure you have a few. We have a lot of polypay sheep where I live. And let's say you breed them to themselves, like it's a maternal line of sheep. The average maternal weight of the ewe and of the grandmother of the ram is 175 pounds. And let's say you used to market these at 70% of their mature size, the appropriate market size for this would be 122 pounds if you're selling to, let's say, the traditional market. You can't really sell 150 or 60-pound lambs from these ewes very efficiently because they'll become too fat and their feed efficiency will be really poor. But if we bred them to a Suffolk ram, which is a much bigger breed of sheep, we could improve the growth traits and the feed efficiency. And 70% of the average size of that sheep with this terminal sire system, we could target a market selling 140-pound lambs, if that happens to be the market you're interested in. Let's think of maybe another scenario, maybe slightly more relevant to some production systems you might be running into. Let's say you have Dorper rams and Katahdin, sorry for the animation here, and a Katahdin ewe base. Let's say you have a 260-pound Dorper ram, his dam weighed 185 pounds, 135-pound Katahdin ewe. So you've brought a little bit of size with the Dorpers into the Katahdin base. The average maternal size of these two are going to be 160 pounds. So these lambs, if you sold them as at 70% of mature size, they'd produce a smaller lamb, which might be perfect for the non-traditional market. If you sold these lambs even leaner at 60% of the mature size, they'd be 100 pounds. That's perfect as well. So that just shows you, kind of how you can improve production efficiency with a system like that. I believe was there one more animation to show perhaps? Or one more poll?
Yes.
Okay. Yep.
You want now?
Yeah, why don't we do it now? Yep.
Okay, good. You can read it over there.
Sure. So I can read if you'd like. How can a terminal sire breeding program improve production efficiency? Just choose one. The choices are larger sheep are more productive. Okay. Faster growing lambs are always more profitable. And having smaller ewes crossed with rams of greater size gives you lower overhead costs in your system. Which one of those is the correct choice?
You're almost done.
All right, great job. Almost all of you had this correct. Nice job. Yeah, certainly they're going to have lower overhead costs when you have smaller sheep for the same lamb output. Okay. So I think I've got just a few minutes left, and I will try to summarize this information from tonight as best I can. So production systems should be chosen based on target markets and your farm and human resources. And that can look different for different farms, and that's okay. Pasture-based systems are going to be lower labor and input. They're going to have lower returns as well, but that doesn't mean they're not profitable. It just means they have lower inputs and a little bit lower returns. So it's the ratio that's important. Intensified systems like accelerated lambing do have greater inputs and returns, and they have more consistent need for labor, but often lower labor per unit product. Ethnic markets, or the non-traditional market, are very diverse and growing throughout the United States, and are going to favor a smaller, leaner lamb. This market segment is well suited for different systems, either pasture-based or intensified production systems. So it isn't necessarily so predicated on the production system because it's pretty broad. And then the size of sheep you raise should be appropriate for your target market. Don't buy the wrong kind of sheep. Buy the right type of sheep that fit your system, that are appropriate genetics in terms of size, and then other traits, which we'll talk about next week, from prolificacy to perhaps parasite resistance, for example, or other considerations in your ewe flock. And we'll cover that next week. So don't pick genetics that are oversized. I guess I tend to emphasize this because when I first started as an extension specialist, I saw a lot of people raising really big sheep and selling to the non-traditional market. And I just wondered if that was the best system, because I thought it was perhaps fairly inefficient. And part of that has to do with the fact that this non-traditional market is not as well, wasn't as well appreciated in 20 years ago. Now I think hopefully with the educational programs we have, people are going to recognize this is a significant target market to look at. So use of a terminal sire system can allow you to create larger lambs using smaller ewes, thus producing your production efficiency. So that is the amount of product you get per unit input. All right. I'm glad to hang around and answer a few questions if you'd like. I can check the chat, see if there's anything there. And if there's any thing I've missed, please let me know. One comment here is about goats, and I'll make that pretty quick. With goats, I didn't talk specifically about goat markets here, but in the but the same principles apply. You need to understand the size of goats that are in demand in your market, and then pick the right mature size animals to fit those markets. If the market demands 60-pound goats, you don't need as big a goats as one that demands 90-pound goats. So I'd argue the same dynamics are at play resource-wise as well. You can have intensified meat goat production systems, or you can have really extensive meat goat production systems. We have folks who accelerate and do accelerate system with meat goats very nicely, but they have really good feed resources. So even though I didn't speak to goats so much in this talk at all, it is quite analogous, most of the things I would have said. Oh, yeah, I do have a contact slide here. I'll leave up, and you'll have access to these slides as well. You're welcome to contact me for any follow-ups you have. I'll just leave this up here if there's any more questions.
In the question and answer button, there is a question about the breeding a larger ram to smaller ewe cause more issues with birthing.
Oh, okay, yeah, I don't see that question, but that's a good one. Okay, yeah. So interestingly, with sheep, that generally in cattle, that's certainly a consideration. With sheep and goats, for that matter, for the most part, we don't see problems with difficult birth. The term, I'll use a fancy term called dystocia, difficult birth. We don't see a big issue with dystocia with according to size. What we do though see, and I think I'll develop that next week a little bit more, is there is sometimes a trade-off in terms of survival of the lambs. So if you use a very large mature size animal on ewes that are small, and this isn't due to difficult birth, but they just don't have quite a high survival rate. They, maybe they're more likely to starve, things like that. So there is a small trade-off there. So there is some lessons to consider there. So there is perhaps, and depends on your production system. If you have a pasture-based system, less supervision of lambing, you might choose to use a terminal sire that's larger but not giant. Okay, and I'll go over this next week. However, if you're in a more intensified system where you're managing your birth period carefully, there's lots of people on hand, you put the lambs in lambing jugs or pens to mother up. In those systems, we don't see much of a drop in survival, but we do tend to see a drop in survival on extensive pasture-based systems when we use too large of a terminal sire.
I also write your contact information in the chat, so the people want to just to have your email and phone number.
Great.
Okay. Yeah. Some people have asked even through email that they are missing part of the presentation. And so we are going to have available the videos, and we are going to have upload everything in a YouTube channel later on for those ones. But they had to go to download and also probably to answer some questions. So we are going to send a short survey for the people that participate in this one. Also asking some evaluation about the webinar, and also to make any proposal how to improve it. So do you have some other thing, Dr. Richard, to say?
I don't. Thanks for your attention, and look forward to coming back next week and diving into this a little deeper.
Okay, well, thank you so much, and we appreciate your time, and also for all the attendees. And we are going to, again, next Monday, 4 o'clock Central Time. Have an excellent time, and thank you so much, Dr. Richard, for all your experience. All these production systems are so good. I mean, with your experience, and also for those ones that don't produce for a specific market, so probably they will be producing with no success. So I think it's so important what you share.
Thank you. Yep.
Okay. See you.
Have a good evening.
Have a good evening.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Doc.